You're here. And that matters more than it might seem at first glance. Not because something dramatic is about to happen. Not because you've arrived at a turning point. But because at some point, you noticed something subtle enough that you didn't immediately dismiss it. Most people move past moments like that without slowing down. They feel a brief pause in their thinking, a slight shift in attention, and then they return to whatever was already familiar. You didn't rush away. You stayed just long enough to wonder. This video isn't about revealing a hidden truth. It isn't about discovering something rare or exclusive. It's simply about noticing what tends to be overlooked when life continues at full speed. You might already recognize the feeling, a quiet sense that something responded, not loudly, not clearly, but just enough to register. Not a message, not a signal, more like an alignment between what you were paying attention to and what happened next. Nothing extraordinary, just noticeable. And that's often where people stop paying attention. You don't need to be told that you're different. You don't need to be labeled as ahead or behind. What matters is that you're human, navigating awareness the same way everyone else does, through patterns, habits, and interpretation. At times, you observe more clearly. At times, you operate almost entirely on autopilot. Both are normal. Neither needs correction. What's interesting is how rarely we talk about the space between those two modes. You've likely had moments where your attention sharpened without effort. Maybe during a walk, or while listening to someone speak, or while doing something repetitive and simple. For a brief moment, you weren't trying to understand anything. You were just noticing, no conclusions, no urgency, just observation. That state doesn't feel intense. It feels calm, almost unremarkable. Which is why it's so easy to miss. In everyday language, people often describe this as being present. But that word has been stretched so thin that it no longer explains much. Presence isn't a performance. It isn't something you maintain. It's something that appears naturally when resistance drops. You don't force it. You don't hold on to it. You notice it after the fact. This is where the idea of frequency often gets misunderstood. Not as a mystical concept, not as something you raise or lower, but as a useful metaphor for how attention organizes experience. Think of frequency the way you'd think of tuning. Not tuning the world, but tuning your noticing. When your attention is scattered, experience feels fragmented. When your attention is steady, experience feels coherent. Externally needs to change for that shift to occur. This isn't philosophy, it's observable. You've likely noticed that when you're distracted, you miss obvious details. When you're calm, details seem to come to you without effort. The environment didn't suddenly add information. Your awareness simply stopped filtering it out. That's the part most people don't pause to examine. We often assume that awareness is constant, that we're always perceiving reality as it is. But in practice, awareness is selective, adaptive, and shaped by expectation. You don't see what's there. You see what your attention is available for. This doesn't mean perception is unreliable. It means it's efficient. Your mind prioritizes relevance over completeness. That's not a flaw. It's how functioning works. But occasionally, that efficiency relaxes. And when it does, something subtle becomes visible. Not something hidden, something ignored. This is often when people say, "I don't know why," but that stood out to me. No explanation, no reason, just recognition. You didn't create that moment. You noticed it. And when you noticed it, something responded, not externally, but internally. A sense of coherence, a feeling that things briefly made more sense without needing to be explained. That response is quiet, so quiet that it doesn't demand interpretation. Most people miss it because they're waiting for something louder. We've been conditioned to associate importance with intensity, big emotions, clear answers, definitive outcomes. But observation doesn't work that way. Observation refines before it reveals. It simplifies before it clarifies. When you observe without immediately labeling what you see, your nervous system stays calm. Your thinking slows down just enough to allow context to form. This is why insight rarely feels dramatic when it happens. It feels obvious, almost too obvious to mention. You might think, I already knew this, and you probably did. But knowing something conceptually and noticing it directly are different experiences. One is stored as information. The other reorganizes perception. There's no need to exaggerate that distinction. It doesn't change who you are. It doesn't grant advantage. It simply adjusts how clearly things are seen. Consider how often you replay conversations in your mind. Not the words, but the tone, the pauses, what wasn't said. At some point you may notice that your interpretation changes, not because new facts appear, but because your perspective softens. Suddenly, something that felt personal no longer does. Something that felt confusing becomes neutral. Not resolved, just less charged. That's observation doing its work quietly. No conclusion required. This same process applies to how you notice patterns in your life. Routines, reactions, assumptions you didn't realize you were carrying. You don't have to dismantle them. You don't even have to judge them. When something is clearly seen, it naturally adjusts over time. Not immediately, not predictably, but consistently. That consistency is what people often mistake for cause and effect. They say, when I noticed this, things changed. But it's not that noticing caused change. It's that noticing removed friction. Less effort, less resistance, more alignment between perception and reality. This is where the idea of observers responding can be misunderstood. There are no external observers tracking you, no hidden audience, no judgment. The response is internal coherence. When awareness stabilizes, experience feels less fragmented. Thoughts align more cleanly with what's happening. Emotional reactions lose some of their momentum. Again, nothing dramatic, just quieter. And quiet is easy to overlook. You may notice this when you stop anticipating outcomes, when you engage with something for its own sake, reading without skimming, listening without planning your reply. In those moments, time feels different, not slower or faster, just less measured. That's not transcendence. It's attentional continuity, and attentional continuity is rare in modern life. Not because it's difficult, but because it's undervalued. We're encouraged to optimize, improve, achieve. Observation doesn't fit neatly into those goals. It doesn't produce immediate results, so it gets ignored. But when it reappears naturally, it feels familiar. Almost like returning to a way of perceiving you had before everything became layered with expectation. You don't need to return to it deliberately. You can't force it anyway. But you can notice when it happens. And when you do, something settles. Not permanently, not completely. Just enough to be noticeable. That may be what brought you here. Not curiosity in the sense of seeking answers, but recognition, a sense that something you've already experienced is being described without exaggeration. That's intentional. There's nothing to sell you here, nothing to persuade you of, only an invitation to continue observing how awareness behaves when it isn't being directed. If this kind of exploration feels familiar or simply comfortable, you might consider staying connected to this channel, not for updates, not for progress, but as a space where observation is allowed to remain quiet, unfinished, and grounded. No pressure either way. For now, just notice what remains after listening. Not thoughts, not conclusions, just the tone of your attention. And let that be enough for the moment.